Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Medicine, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. My name's Claire Clark. I'm one of the hosts on this channel. And today we're talking to Eric Hayot, a distinguished professor of comparative literature and Asian studies at the Pennsylvania State University and the author of the new book, Humanist Reason, A History, an Argument, a Plan, which is just out from Columbia University Press. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
Eric, I'm excited to talk to you today. I love this book. It's so much food for thought in here. I wondered if you could begin our interview by just telling us a little bit about yourself. So, how did you get to be a distinguished professor at the Pennsylvania State University?
Yeah, well, so I grew up multilingual, and I carried that set of interests with me into college. And I grew up as someone who loved to read. I grew up as someone who loved to write. And then I had a class in my junior year of college with a guy named Henry Schwartz. It was a class on post-colonial literature, and it was one of those magic classes that turns you into or gives you someone to be. I mean, that is, Henry was young. He had just finished his PhD at Duke, and he was in his first or second year at Georgetown, and I just thought he was the coolest and smartest and most interesting, and I basically wanted to be just like him. And one of the things that Henry had done, he was from just a white guy from a town somewhere in, I think either Jersey or in any case, somewhere there. And he had learned Bengali as part of his PhD work. And I thought that was amazing. And I decided that I should learn a non-Western language. And so I spent some time. I started studying Chinese, and then so I went to grad school to get a PhD in English literature. But along the way, I learned Chinese and spent a year in China and got a fellowship to be there and to work on my first book, which was on the influence of China on European literature and philosophy, mainly in the 20th century. And so that was kind of part of what I did. And I was really lucky to have an amazing advisor who taught me a lot about writing and about the forms of psychological discipline necessary to write and to think well. And so that was amazing and incredibly powerful. Her name was Jane Gallup, And so that got me launched into the profession in my, the first kind of 10 years of my career, basically writing about two books, ultimately my dissertation, which became the first book, and then the second book about the ways in which Europe dealt with its encounter with China after the sort of 1580s forward. And by the end of that second book, at some point I had an idea for another book on literary worlds, and so I wrote that book. And then at some point I wrote a book about writing, which is probably what I'm most famous for. I don't know if it's what I'm most distinguished for, but it's what I'm most famous for, which is this book called The Elements of Academic Style, which is a book about how to write. And for anyone who's working in the humanities, more or less. I mean, it's a lot of it's literature specific because that's my field, but that was a book where I kind of made a transition, I think, between someone whose teaching and writing lives were completely separate to someone who was actually writing about teaching. And that's stayed a little bit true here and there. I mean, I've bounced around, but I think that one of the things that I learned in that book was that there were things that I was doing when I was teaching that I could carry over into my writing that people really valued and liked. And one of the things that's been really gratifying about the Elements book is that people have written me from all over the world and said how much it helped them. And so I think with the new book, part of what I was trying to do was to manage for myself something like the relationship between writing that is doing teaching work and writing that is doing scholarly work, and trying to think about how to bring those two together in ways that seemed interesting. In any case, I guess you end up being a distinguished professor because you have good teachers and because you write books, and because you're able to sort of sustain a level of intensity and interest in a set of topics for long enough that at some point they have no choice but to, but to give you the title. But that, really, if you had to say what are the real reasons, I loved languages, I loved writing, and I had great teachers.
Well, the elements of academic style is what brought your work to my attention. I would be should have been one of those people who sent you an email to say how much I learned from that book and what a really invaluable guide it's kind of been to me. This book is equally great, I have to say. Tell us how did you come to write Humanist Reason?
Well, so it took me a long time, longer than it had, longer than the previous three books had taken, and I think at various moments in the trajectory of this book, it had a different title. It had very different kind of structure and organization. It was more scholarly at one point. It had a very different third chapter. But it came down to, I think one of the things that my books have consistently shared is that they are all really interested in, but maybe not so much true for the writing book, but the other books, really interested in two different things that come together in this book. The first thing is I'm interested in ideas that seem incredibly attractive and powerful to me, but that I suspect are, because they're so attractive or powerful, I suspect they might be wrong or that there might be some problems with them. And I'm also attracted to ideas that seem to challenge at their deepest level the ideas that I hold most dear. So that's maybe part number one. And then part number two, which is something I've really been consistently interested in, again, for the last three books, is something like the tension between the example and the theory of something. So the tension between what one does, especially in my field in literature, which is the tension between, you're looking at a single novel, but you're doing work on a single novel or a single poem. And thanks to all the work you're doing and all the interpretive activity that you're doing, you end up saying things that draw very intimately from that piece of evidence, but are applicable broadly outside that piece of evidence. And I'm interested in that relationship, and I'm interested in the whether, in fact, the theory ever fully frees itself from the sticky example, or whether, in fact, theories are always, in some sense, bound to the examples that they begin with, and if they remain bound, then can't be fully generalizable. That is, I've been interested in that kind of tension between the example and the general, or the particular and the general, for a long time. And so those come together in this book in ways that involve recognizing the centrality to humanistic forms of knowledge of that very problem, and recognizing in some respects the ways in which the humanities fields have both adopted a very particular attitude towards that problem, but also have been defined by their attitude in ways that I think are, for the most part, not great, I guess. Both not true and not great. That is, not true in the sense that I think the humanities have been defined by an attitude towards knowledge and have defined themselves by an attitude towards knowledge that I think is actually not correct if you look at it in relation to what the humanities actually do, but also not great in the sense that it has not been useful or good for the humanities to define themselves that way.
Right. So, so I attended an interdisciplinary PhD program for grad school, and in grad school, I learned that one of the first questions you're sort of supposed to ask when you're thinking about methodology and you're thinking about human subjects research ethics is whether your study, the question you're asking, is seeking quote unquote generalizable knowledge. And if the answer to that question is yes, then I was taught your research is probably scientific or it's social scientific. And if it's no, that is you're studying something unique, specific, particular then your study's probably humanistic. You think that this distinction, or you argue in Humanist Reason, that this distinction is totally wrongheaded. um, can you tell us why, and where does this distinction come from?
So, I mean, yes, I think that distinction is bogus. But I think it's completely understandable that you would be taught that. That is, I think that distinction, one of the things I show in the book. So the book is two things, which is to say it's a history of the way in which the precise distinction that you're articulating, came to be defined as the primary distinction between two different forms of knowledge, the humanistic on one side and the scientific on the other, with the scientific largely including, again, the social sciences. Obviously, you have the humanistic social sciences. So one of the ironies about the current division of knowledge as we experience it today is we have, in some respects, three groups: humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. But in fact, those three groups are actually split right down the middle into two large-scale fields, which is the scientific field, so the scientific social sciences, or social sciences as it's done, quantitatively with numbers and so on, and then the humanistic social sciences. So we have a tripartite division, which is actually a bipartite division.
Mm-hmm.
My argument in the book is that specific structure, that is both the division of knowledge into three fields and the division of knowledge in some sense, so three institutional fields, and then the division of knowledge into two methodological zones: the general or the generalizable law-oriented group and the non-generalizable particularistic group, dates from the late 1800s, and specifically from the formation of those institutional structures in the German university. And so I won't go on about it here because you've read the book, but the argument is, one of the things I do in the book is I trace the origin, or a couple origin points, of that division, which is incredibly powerful, dominant, and dominant to the point that it can be taught as a kind of common sense, as it was taught to you in school. But this common sense is not just the one of whatever particular faculty member introduced you to that subject, or introduced it that way, but in fact a way that many, many people think. And again, part of the argument in the book is not that this is some kind of bad way of thinking that denigrates the humanities as a kind of particularistic field of knowledge, but rather that this way of thinking about the humanities science divide emerges from within the humanities themselves, and has been regularly since the 1880s used from within the humanities to describe what makes the humanities better, more special, more interesting, more ethical than the sciences. So one of the things that's really interesting about the story of the humanities sciences division is that, in fact, the very same structure, generalizable versus particular, that you've described, which in your description sounds like basically scientific knowledge is good and useful, and humanistic
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is just like talking about your feelings or making stuff up that's only good for you. So it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like scientific knowledge is the awesome part of that, and humanistic knowledge is kind of nonsense, is used and
And in
has been
medical
used.
school, oh, sorry.
Yes, in
Oh no,
medical
go
school,
ahead.
right?
Yeah, in medical school they call it non-cognitive skills.
Right,
Not
which is,
like, actually, like I was like, not I when I heard that I thought, really, we don't use our brains at all for the
right. Right. So
so
that's the negative version of this story. That is the anti-humanistic version of this story. And that version is false for all kinds of reasons, and I'm happy to discuss. But part of my point in the book is to show that, in fact, a kind of mirrored version of that story that has exactly the same logic is, in fact, part and parcel of how the humanities have defined themselves, or humanists have defined the work that they're doing. For the last 100 years, for reasons, again, that go back to this moment in the formation of the German university and expand outward from that moment. So my argument in the book is not only that, not what one might expect, which is all these people saying humanities knowledge is dumb or non-cognitive are wrong, but actually also all the people on the humanities side who are using similar arguments to argue that humanities knowledge is uniquely ethical and uniquely protected from the kinds of epistemological errors that take place in the sciences are actually also wrong. And they're wrong as a factual matter. That is to say that they're wrong this is a false description of what humanist knowledge production looks like. And then the secondary argument is that not only is it false, but actually it's bad for the humanities because it basically encourages us in our living in a world in which, for instance, as I say in the book, everyone knows what the scientific method is, and all school children around the world are taught what the scientific method is, and so science is presented from the get-go as a kind of method for truth discovery, whereas there is no equivalent of a humanist method, partly not because the humanities don't have methods, but because, in fact, the humanities are considered not to be primarily a method of truth discovery. Claire, I'm going to ask you a weird question about Twitter. Have you been following the MC Hammer science versus philosophy controversy on Twitter that's taken place in the last week?
I've seen it. I've not been able to avoid it. So
Okay.
I've seen bits and pieces of it.
So, it's a perfect instance of this, which is MC Hammer, who apparently has been reading Foucault,
Mm-hmm.
is responding to someone who says basically science is about finding truth, philosophy is about opinions and so on and so forth. And MC Hammer, for whatever reason, has then become adopted by all the humanist people I know because they're sort of cheering for him in this battle. But in any case, I will say that that's a good example of the complete ubiquity of this specific debate. And I have a position in the debate, but my argument would be that over and over, when the debate is framed this way, given the way that our society is currently organized and organizes its knowledge, the humanities lose. And so part of the book is most of the book is actually not trying to convince scientists or people who think the sciences are better than humanities to stop talking about things that way because they'll do what they want, but really to convince humanists themselves to stop talking about the humanities in the way that they do and start talking about it in slightly different ways.
So the book is really interesting structurally. And in the introduction, you write that there tend to be these sort of two kinds of books about the humanities. So on the one hand, you have scholarship that's about the history of the humanities. You mentioned the German Research University, those sorts of serious scholarly peer-reviewed works. And then on the other hand, books that are taken to be more like manifestos about the current moment of crisis in the humanities and why the humanities are worth saving and why they must be saved. And this book, Humanist Reason, really kind of tries to be both. So it situates the manifesto part comes out of the history. Can you talk a little bit about the book's structure and how the sort of two halves of the book are related to each other?
Well, so I think part of it is that my argument, often when people are making arguments about the humanities, they're making arguments about a very particular institutional formation that they argue should be preserved. Or they're making arguments about the nature of why the humanities are good arguments. Which is also fine. I feel like there are enough of those books, and that people who will be convinced by those books have already been convinced by them. And so I didn't need to write another book like that. And I don't think anyone really necessarily needs to write it. I mean, obviously, I'm sure someone will and probably is right now writing another book like that. But I feel like those books, first of all, haven't done that much good. And second, tend to be really focused on specific institutional structures. At the same time, I wanted to produce a defense of the humanities or a defense of humanist thinking, and really a defense is probably the wrong way to talk about it, an argument about humanist thinking that would clearly emerge from a historical context, but would show why, in fact, that historical context has given us a set of problems that we need then to push back against. So it's a book where, the first chapter reads like a kind of pretty standard intellectual history chapter, which is to say it's a history of the university. There's lots of quotes, there's translations of things from German and so on and so forth. I do some close reading and interpretation. I, contextualize all sorts of stuff. And then the second chapter is really a chapter about the philosophy behind the theories of the humanities that emerge in the previous chapter. And the third chapter is then quite different. And in some respects, the third chapter borrows a little bit of its attitude and its logic from The Elements of Academic Style. So one of the things that I should explain what that book is for your listeners who don't know. The main thing that the Elements of Academic Style does is to break down into pieces the work of writing and the action of writing, and to treat writing as essentially a craft that can be a craft whose practice can be improved in any individual who is willing to sort of learn a few rules and try a few experiments to get better at stuff. One of the things that I wrote that book to counter was a lot of other kinds of writing books which tend to view writing as a matter of inspiration or as a matter of expression. My argument in Elements was, good writing tends to have these patterns or structures. And if you can master some of these, you'll become a better writer, whether or not, you were a good writer in your heart to begin with. And so that model of how to think about what writing is then carries over to the third chapter of Humanist Reason. And the third chapter of Humanist Reason is certainly less programmatic than the writing book. But the third chapter of Humanist Reason basically says, here's a kind of structural breakdown of ways of thinking that are common to most humanistic activity. And there's 9 of them. And if you learn these as kind of basic principles, you will both understand what the humanities do and believe, but also you'll be, I think, implicitly a better humanistic thinker. So the book kind of pivots after chapters 1 and 2, which are really scholarly in a much more conventional way, into a third chapter that is more like a manual in some respects. And insofar as it's a manual, it's also a description. But insofar as it's a description, it's also a description of something that it's describing something that exists, but I think has never really been described this way. And so it's hoping to do some of the work that all good description does, which is not only to paint the picture of something that exists, but to actually create a new picture of something that people hadn't quite seen in this way ever before. And by creating that new picture, then giving people a kind of manifesto or a set of beliefs that they can bring forward to bear on the problem of the humanities institutionally today. So the book then differs from a lot of kind of manifestos for the humanities in not trying to justify the humanities, but trying to describe the humanities in ways that make it clear that they ought to then be justified and make it easier in some sense to justify them.
And can you you write though that this description is not it doesn't come out and you call them articles, right? These kind of articles or these principles of humanistic reason, that this doesn't that they aren't derived from first principles. These kind of aren't like they didn't come down from heaven, but that you got them from history and lessons of, I think you write, the history of humanistic truth seeking. So there's a way in which they're historically grounded as well, I think. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So again, like if you go back 200 years, then the articles of Humanist Reason would look quite different. I mean, because so they're descriptive in that sense, and part of what I mean by that is that they're evidence based, rather than, in some sense, again, philosophically derived from a set of basic logical sort of principles and so on. What I'm doing is I'm looking at, having read hundreds, if not thousands, of articles and books written by humanist scholars, going back a couple hundred years minimally. And I mean, I don't necessarily think, I don't think of Plato as a modern humanist, or Aristotle or Confucius as a humanist. So really thinking about the modern disciplines of the humanities, having read those, these are the things that I think that humanists believe in general. That is, I think that you could take the articles that I'm describing and go find a book from the 1950s and ask, does this book basically believe this thing? And the answer would be yes. Does it know it believes it? I don't always know. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm doing is I'm describing basic ways of thinking that are in some respects so simple that they are not frequently articulated and not necessarily even frequently conscious, but are fundamental parts of how people become scholars of the humanities and publish work in the humanities that university presses and other scholars recognize as legitimate. So it's really a description of what the basic underlying principles of humanistic scholarship as humanists recognize it today. But again, it's a description that I think most humanists would not necessarily recognize themselves, because the things I'm describing are, as I say, largely below the level of observation or the level of consciousness.
Can you give us an example? There are 9 of these articles,
Yes.
principles. I don't know that we have time to do all of them, but can you give us a couple of highlights?
Well, so the first one, which is the easiest one, is this simple thing, which is that humanist reasoners, that is, people who are trying to reason in humanistic ways, believe that all the so okay. Let me begin with a couple of simpler things. Humanists, in general, study the work or study the history and work and social interactions and processes and events and artifacts that characterize human societies, right? Which means that humanists
Mhm.
are, begin with, and can begin with easily the anthropological record of the development and evolution of human beings and extend all the way to the present, and that their field proper is anything humans have done. And what they try to do is they try to describe those things, they try to explain them, they try to understand whether there are or are not general laws that govern those things. Um, and they try to understand the meaning of those things, both for the people living at the time and for the present. They do all kinds of work to grasp what you might think of as the epistemological totality. That is the whole set of things that can be thought and said in an era as a way of understanding that era or that particular circumstance or position. What that means is that humanists also, because human beings have never, and this is an evidentiary statement and a factual statement, have never lived outside of the environment of this planet and have never lived without interacting extensively with objects, non-human objects like tools, but also gifts, artwork of all kinds, precious objects of all kinds, including, of course, the objects that are their own bodies. Um, and because humans have never lived in a circumstance in which they don't interact with the natural world, living and non-living, that is the geological world of climate, but also the living world of nature and of animals, that humanists study and consider human beings in their interactions with those things. So that's what humanists do. It's a big job, and it's a complicated job, and one of the things that I think then, so we come, so if I say that's what humanists do, basically, this is the list of things they study. First of all, I hope it's clear that, in fact, what humanists do is not confined at all to the departments of history, literature, or philosophy, or even sociology, anthropology, and so on, as they're conventionally conceived. That is, for me, the study of humanist study includes elements of geology, biology, physics, astrophysics and astronomy, and medicine, obviously, and so on and so forth, right? So that's so part of what I'm trying to describe is a humanities that's not delimited by its institutional structure. Now, within that framework, what I think is that humanists in general believe that all objects, processes, or events take place and are determined partly but not entirely by a historical context. This, I think, is essentially uncontroversial. If you have
Mhm.
something, to understand what that thing is, to understand how it works, you have to understand where it comes from, what the circumstances are that surround it, One of the things I do when I teach my class on video games is I show my students a picture of an Etruscan vase, and I say, imagine that you dig up this vase. What kinds of questions can you ask about this vase? And we come up with questions. Who used it? Why was it used? Was it unique? Was it mass produced? Where was it produced? Was it made in the same place that it was used? Was it is it the kind of thing that could be bought and sold, or could it only be given as a gift? Could it be used by men and women, slaves and non-slaves? Could it be used inside the home or outside the home? Is there a story to it? And then you can ask all sorts of questions like, what is the technology that produced it? What kinds of clay? What kinds of paint produced this thing? What kinds of technological processes? Because to understand this one vase, you have to know all of those things in order to begin to get what it means, right? To understand what it means, for the same reason that to understand any use of any word, you have to know the words that come before and after it, and true of any gesture, right? So this is at some level completely obvious, but I think it needs to be said aloud. And I think what humanists believe, and but there's a strain of warfare inside humanism, and also between the humanists and certain versions of positivist science, that says that ultimately, if you could figure out absolutely everything about a thing, you could determine its meaning fully and absolutely. And I think humanists in general don't believe that. That is, they believe that, and again, on evidentiary grounds, they don't believe this because they like to feel this way. They believe this because history over and over shows them that this is true. That even if you know as much as is possible to know about a given society, nonetheless, there will be objects in that society that surprise you. There will be objects in that society that say new things. As you can imagine, if you knew absolutely, I'll compare this to an example I use a couple times in the book. A simple physics problem, the movement of a set of billiard balls on a table. If you know absolutely everything about a system, a simple physical system like this, you can, of course, wind it forward and backward, as far forward and backward as you'd like, and still be able to determine every single point and position of the balls in relation to the other balls in relation to the table. So a system like that allows you to, once you achieve a certain degree of knowledge, to show or determine the contents of that system forward and backward in time eternally on the basis of the full knowledge of a single point in that system. Full knowledge including basically position, velocity, friction, coefficient, and so on. In the humanities, there is no social system for which that is true, right? There's no social system for which it is either possible to know. There's certainly no social system for which anyone has known this thing. And my guess is that there probably never will be. And the reason there never will be is, and again, but you never say never, but my guess is the reason that there never will be is inductive, partly, which is there never has been. So odds are low that it's going to happen anytime soon. But two, if I had to make a more general argument about it, I would say something like the complexity of mind-based social systems is such that there will always be the possibility of surprise in the system. That would be a kind of general claim that I would make. And I think humanists in general believe this. So one of the consequences for humanist reason that follows from this idea, which is that everything is partially determined but not completely determined by its context, right? That is to say, if you tell me your age, I mean, again, imagine all the things Google knows about you or Facebook knows about you, your age, your wealth, your location, and so on and so forth. They can make, of course, all kinds of predictions about the kinds of ads you'll click on, the kinds of news stories you'll like, and so on and so forth, right? At the same time, they don't know everything about you. And at the same time, you're not identical to some other person who's exactly your age, has exactly your amount of money, and so on and so forth, right? And your race and gender status. That is, we know that there are possibilities for escape in the system, even though, of course, in the history of human life, lots of people enjoy thinking about either utopian or dystopian versions of the system in which everything would be controlled, right? So that means it's a fun thing to think about, but I think my claim would be it's never existed. So if you believe this, that is, if you understand and begin with the idea that when you're trying to think about the kinds of things humanists think about, you need to know a lot of context, but you need to see that things are always going to be escaping or exceeding the set of available contexts that are defined in the social space from which they emerge. Then what that means, what that entails as a matter of epistemological principle and practice is that you must study things that didn't happen but could have happened. So what that means is that to study, let's say, to study a historical event, the election of Donald Trump, right, in 2016, is to have to think about and understand what could have happened that didn't happen, which is to say Donald Trump could have not become president, among other things. There's lots of things that could have happened, right? Or people, or Jill Stein could have run differently, or Bernie Sanders could have not gotten in a fight with Hillary, or Hillary and Bill could have not done the Whitewater thing, or the United States could have been less sexist, and so on and so forth, right? You can make all sorts of predictions. So part of what my argument is then, if things are determined by their context, but not absolutely so, then knowing what could have happened is part of understanding things, even though it didn't happen, which means that part of the work of humanist reason is necessarily what you might call imaginative, but not imaginative because it's about, quote unquote, making things up, or because it's about people saying, quote, whatever they want, or because it's non-cognitive, because it's imaginative in that sense, but because in order to think seriously about what a situation was, what it meant, how it worked, you have to think about the things that didn't happen inside it. So that's Article 1. I mean, Article 1 goes on for a while, but that's essentially Article 1 of the 9 articles that I lay out. Is this is a basic structure of humanist reason, and a lot of what it entails, as you see, is insisting that the kinds of things that either humanists or non-humanists, the kind of thing non-humanists sometimes criticize the humanities for, or sometimes the things that humanists argue make a kind of unique and special difference about humanity, are in fact not about some kind of ethical commitment to freedom, which is how you often see the description of the freedom from social context being described, but actually matters of epistemological seriousness that are based on the humanistic study of evidence, of the evidence of the past, right? So that is a basic thing. And I want to add something which I don't say in the book, but is really important, is that part of what that means is that the context for any of these things that we study, and again, the Trump election is a perfect example, the context for anything we study is never closed for as long as human society exists. Meaning that, in fact, the meaning of any historical event is partly going to be determined by things that happen in the future that we don't know about, but we can maybe imagine. So, for instance, consider, again, having seen the last 4 years of Trump, the ways in which mid-20th century fascism has suddenly acquired a new historical relevance. Again, whether you think Trump is a fascist or not, the rise in interest in talking about fascism, is Trump fascist? Is he not fascist? Is this really like fascism? Well, it's not exactly like fascism, and so on and so forth. My point is that these are arguments about, of course, Trump at some level, but they're also changes in the historical meaning of the mid-20th century and the political movements that are associated with it. So that what we thought those things meant one thing when we thought, well, that's over, and now we're never going to have that again. And they mean a very different thing when all of a sudden a bunch of people start thinking, holy moly, we're about to have that same stuff happen. And
well, an example might be historians of medicine are thinking about infectious disease totally differently now in an era of COVID-19, right? So all of a sudden, everyone is like rushing to edit the last chapter of their books to say, in the era
right.
of COVID, right? Yeah,
right. And this also changes pretty radically. I mean, I think you're going to see tons of new studies of 1918. Not just from historians of medicine, but also I think you're going to see people writing books about plagues in the past. And then you're going to see people writing books about fictions of plagues, right? That is that these things that come to us from the past can be renewed in a really powerful and profound way by changes in the present. And the point is not that these things meant what they meant and now we're twisting them to mean something else, but that the meaning of any event is determined contextually all the way forward, right? So if you say, what's the real meaning of, the 1918, I'll say, well, I can tell you what it was, and I can tell you what it is now. Good Lord, did you hear that? Okay, my computer just made a very loud beep. I'm sorry, it was an internet reminder. We'll have to cut that little bit out. Sorry about that. let me come back and say, so the real meaning of 1918 was one thing then, it's another thing now. And, if in fact it turns out that we beat back the coronavirus and then, 80 years from now, everyone's complacent and there's another one, it'll do something else then. Or if there's not, something else will happen. That is the meaning of these historical events, the significance and the, it's one thing to be the worst plague ever, and it's another thing to be the first in a series of really bad plagues that reappear chronically every 100 years. And we don't know which one the 1918 influenza was and won't know. And so, the meaning of that thing is determined contextually, as I say, but it's determined contextually in a much wider variety of contexts than we even have access to, which is why humanistic knowledge, among other things, can use material from the past. It's why Aristotle and Plato and Confucius still have things to say to us today, even though in some sense, they're very old, because in fact, our context's changing, including, for instance, a new article on, what Greek life was like under Aristotle, so new scholarship can do it, but also our lives can do it. Our lives changing will then change the meaning and value of those texts.
I want to make sure, I could talk about the articles all day long, but I want to make sure that we get to your argument about method. Because we all know the sciences, they have method. They have the scientific method. It's a series of steps, right? Scientists have reason and they have method. Your book, Humanist Reasons, outlines a humanistic method. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, so let me say a couple things. First of all, the distinction between the humanities and the natural sciences is a pretty modern distinction, as we know. I don't think it's necessarily the case that you can say. I think you can say that there is physics before Galileo easily, right? After all, the word physics is a Greek word. You can say that there's biology, right? That there. And so when we talk about scientific reason today, what we're talking, and the scientific method, we're actually not talking about all of science from all of history, right? We're not talking about the method that people who, believed in the humors used. Even though in fact there are some overlaps, a lot of human knowing, even not, non-institutionalized knowing is about trial and error. Does this taste good? Does it not taste good? What happens when I set this on fire? What happens when I cook this in an oven as opposed to boil it in a pot? Cooking, if you want to think about it as a procedure, is a knowledge procedure and an experimental procedure. And people have been cooking for a lot longer than they've been doing science. And there's a lot in common between, again, basic living strategies, and animals use these strategies too. Is this good to eat? Is it not good to eat? Does it hurt when I do this? These are basic questions that you could certainly describe using some of the elements of what we use normally to describe the scientific method. So what happens is, of course, that in the modern period, the scientific method modifies itself through the work of lots of people in ways that then produce a kind of an idea of modern science as somehow uniquely different, importantly different from the science of the previous era, and that modern science produces immense technological achievements, which including vaccines and so on. Mm-hmm. The humanist reason that I'm describing is modern humanist reason, which is to say the humanist reason that borrows from that scientific revolution many of the basic principles that also shape that scientific revolution. And I think that that's not, that I don't think that's particularly controversial. That is that I think that when I'm talking about humanistic method, part of what I'm thinking about is the humanistic method that characterizes the modern humanities and the ones that we know and live with. The trick with the humanistic method, and I want to be very careful here because I think the scientific method is a caricature of what scientists really do. Mm-hmm. And I say this not to mock or degrade anyone in science. I just, it's taught this way. But if you look at a description of what scientists really do, say, how does a scientist really get to be a scientist? Well, part of it involves all kinds of social structures and factors: mentoring, grant availability, university support for research, or national and international support for research, talking with colleagues, hanging out, shooting the breeze in the halls till something clicks, hearing about an idea and making a connection. There's all kinds of stuff that isn't really captured by this stripped down version of the scientific method, so-called. Nonetheless, that's okay because we have models for a reason. Models are useful and they help us think through things. So the point is not we shouldn't have models. The point is that when I imagine that it would be nice to have a humanistic method, I'm not imagining that either science or the humanities could be reduced to either one of these methods. And I also want to insist that a lot of the things I'm talking about are designed to bring the humanities closer, I think, to the idea of science than they are to bring science closer to the idea of the humanities. That is, I think that the humanities and science share many of the procedures that I'm describing, including, and this is why I've been emphasizing it over and over here in our conversation, and I do this also in the book, including the reliance on evidence to make claims. Because, of course, one of the characters of the humanities is that it doesn't rely on evidence, it relies on feeling. So every time I say things like, objects have a historical context and humanists believe this, part of what I'm saying is humanists believe this because they have evidence that tells them that this is the case, not
Right.
humanists believe this as a matter of faith and then they find it in the world, right? So the humanistic method, I would say that if there's a humanistic method, the thing that it begins with, which often the sciences can skip, but not always, is the determination of a legitimate object. So the thing about human life is that in the social, people determine objects all the time, right? They determine objects. So I say this is a book, or this is a chair. That's a determination of an object, and it's a conventional determination. You imagine, we imagine that we have a determination of. Imagine that we had two different words. We had a word for the whole hand, and we just had a word for the palm of your hand. We do, in fact, right? Those are determinations, right? They're determinations made by physical shape. We have words for feelings, right? You can say, what's the difference between jealousy and envy? People can begin to tell you. We also know that there are cultures that have words for feelings that we don't have. That is, we maybe have the feelings, but we don't have the word, right? So Schadenfreude. Impfneid, I just learned today, is a German word for the envy you feel when other people have the vaccine and you don't.
Oh, I've not heard that. That's a good word.
So a useful word, right? A useful word. But of course, it's a feeling one has, but it simply hasn't been named, right? But so one of the things that we do with words and with concepts is we name and determine the boundaries of objects. And at the same time, we know that first of all, that we know that there are concepts or forces that influence us that are not named by our society. Right. We know, for instance, that the people who lived on Easter Island, who basically deforested and then depopulated their own island, were the victims of forces that they may not have been able to describe in the ways that we did. We know that fire burning 3,000 years ago used oxygen to burn, even though the people who were burning that fire didn't know what oxygen was or have a concept of oxygen. Right. We know that people have forms of trauma that are in their unconscious that shape their lives, even though they themselves can't recognize that shaping, right? Even something like personality, which we describe as, a set of factors that shape, so why does so-and-so always end up with guys who treat her badly, right? A kind of question that one could ask about somebody, right? Is about trying to describe or name a force that doesn't have a name or a shape, that is nonetheless shaping someone. So humanists begin the work of thinking by considering the socially determined objects that are available to them, right? What do they look like? What are they? What do people think they are? How do they use them? But also by trying to consider whether there are non-determined structures or patterns, whether these patterns are geological or climate oriented or environmental, as in the case of Easter Island, or the Little Ice Age, which had huge effects on human culture, or whether they're psychological. We know, for instance, and medical historians know this perfectly well, that you can increase the incidence of a disease by naming it and putting it in the DSM.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That there are certainly, I read a fascinating article, this is about 20 years ago in the Atlantic, about the disorder in which people acquire a psychological fetish for self-amputation and the debate about whether to put it in the DSM, because the people who were seeing patients with this knew that by naming it and putting it in the DSM, some people with what you might think of as a kind of inchoate psychological disorder of some kind would fasten upon the particular shape of this named and defined social structure, and then in some sense acquire the disease, even though it wasn't a disease that they'd had to begin with. So we have all these examples, and so part of what I would do if I were trying to teach this if I were making a list is I would say determine the shape of the object of your research, but that's a really complicated question. But you can begin by saying that what is a poem? Is a poem? Imagine I have a poem for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is the object the poem? Or is it the poem and all the other poems written by the same poet? Because if you don't know about those, you can't read the poem by itself, because you won't know. If I give you a poem and I tell you the poem is from 2020, or if I give you the same poem and I tell you it's from 1600, you'll have very different feelings. Right? About, if it's from 1600 and the guy's writing about, Obama being president in 2008, you're going to think, oh my God, this is the most prescient poem. This guy must have had some kind of weird access to the future, been a time traveler. So, right. So this beginning of the determination of the object is the beginning of humanist method. And you'll see already from all the examples that I've been giving you that in some sense, you could build an entire course around the very basic question of what is your object? And keep talking about this for a long time before you developed any definitive rules. And we know there are some basic rules and so on, so we can go through them. But I would say that's a really important process. And I think that for me, when you think about humanist reason, part of it is each of these objects that I'm describing is being described via a kind of looping mechanism. So you're saying, what is the object here? What is an object that somehow is interesting to me? Interesting to me because other people are interested in it, interesting to me because it seems to have something to say about something that I'm interested in, whatever it is, right? And then you're looping back and forth between that object and its context until you feel like you have a handle on that object. And again, by object, I just mean a research object. So your research object could be a process, divorce, family breakup. Right. It could be a series of legal decisions. It could be the institutionalization of a form of medical care, whatever your object is.
Right.
So part of a lot of the beginning or preliminary work of humanist work is working through that object. And if I were teaching this in a class, I would begin with, because I think it's easy to work with students, I would begin with a text. And I would begin with a text that had multiple versions or multiple, so we know, for instance, we have texts that have come to us from the Greeks that we receive in multiple versions through Roman editions or sometimes Arabic editions. So we don't have the original. We just have versions of an original that have been changed in some way. So the question is, what's your object, right? What is your object the original? How would you reconstruct that? So there's work you could do even with school students, right, in which you would show them how the basic work of reconstructing and working to build an object would in fact be, could be, among other things, that could be the end of humanist work, right? In fact, whole people have written whole books saying, this is what I think on the basis of all my research and philological study and so on and so forth, this is what I think this object probably looked like in its origin. Right. So that's something you could do with students. And what you would do as you do that is you would introduce them to all of the basic articles, including the question of contextualization and freedom and so on and so forth, but also all of the sort of all sorts of things we know about processes of historical change and transformation that would be incredibly fascinating, and so on. So, but imagine that then, you want to take a second step in your humanist method. So it's not enough for you. Although, again, as I say, it's certainly 30 years ago, and even today, you could get tenure in a classics department by writing a book in which you basically described really well the original of some of these things. So this is legit humanist research. But you've done that. So you've done your object, and as you're figuring out what your object is, you're looping back and forth between contextualization and refining of the object, right? And so you've got this process. Then I think that the next question you want to do, or the next thing you want to do, is to say, why am I interested in this object? Right? This is something that doesn't appear often in the description of the scientific method, but there are things we can know that no one cares about. And so, any scientist who begins, why am I interested in this? Like, if you say, why should anyone care about this thing that I'm interested in? That's actually a pretty important part of the scientific method as well, right? Why am I interested in this?
Right.
What is this for? What am I able to do with this that's going to change something about, and again, I would say that this is true for both science and the humanities, that is going to change something about the way that people today think. Because the end point of all scientific and humanistic research is the present, or a future of the present in which people think differently. Why is it worth my time to, for instance, study patterns of redlining in American housing markets, right, in the 1950s? What is that for? It's not so I can go back in time and change patterns of racial discrimination that force African Americans out of white neighborhoods and so on and so forth, or devalue housing markets and units that are owned by African Americans. It's so that I can do something in the present, right? And again, that could be, why do I need to understand? Why am I working on quantum mechanics? I'm working on it because I want to sort of, see if we can develop technology to travel faster than light, or to transfer information faster than light. Why am I studying the formation of the universe? Why am I studying whatever it is, right? That one studies, and a research question. So for me, that's the second phase: is what is this for? Having defined this object, what is this for? What debates or connections or ideas is this going to be able to sort of change in the present? Right? Why would anyone care? Why? And again, the people who care could be a very small group of people, could be a larger group of people, right? But orienting your research question towards that, and then thinking about basically, I think as a kind of third or fourth step, in this. Hold on, Claire, we need to pause for 1 second. I need to look something up in the book.
Sure.
I'm coming to it. Okay, but I need to remember the order of some of these things. Sorry. And I hope I'm not going on too long about this, but
No, I was actually, it's really funny you said that. I was going to the book too, right at this moment. So.
Okay. So, okay, right. All right, let's begin again.
Okay.
I think that once you define and shape the object, you've oriented toward a set of questions, right? That as you begin to analyze the object, I would say that the one of the key elements of humanistic reason is the challenge of how do you generalize away from that object. The difference between that and something like a really standard version of science. If you say standard version of science, you're gonna look at a bunch of cells, and you're going to test their behavior, and you're going to basically produce a statistical model of their responses to a certain influence of some kind. That part of what you're doing in that moment is you're trying to strip away as much as possible the external patterns and structures that keep you from generalizing. So you want to make sure that the cells are all roughly identical. You want to make sure they're stored at roughly the same temperatures. You want to make sure that you don't one day, walk your culture through, a sunny atrium, and the next day you walk it through a darkened hallway, and so you end up with half the cultures that get exposed to sunlight for 10 minutes, right? So you're trying to strip away things that block generalization. Right? Because otherwise you're going to have one result for the cells that were in the sun and one result for the cells that weren't in the sun, and that's not good. You can't generalize from all the cells. Now you just have sun cells and non-sun cells. In the humanities, our objects tend to be, because of their complexity and richness in the cultural context, it would be, on the one hand, you can take any one of us, you or me, and generalize. Imagine an alien species picks you or me off the planet and takes us into space and then asks everything they know. On the one hand, they could get some pretty good generalizations from just one of us about, what humans are like and so on and so forth, right? On the other hand, they might not get everything because, of course, there are differences between you and me. And the differences between you and me are relatively, we're both living in the United States, we're both academics, so on and so forth. Imagine they take a person from another country or another time, right? All of a sudden you begin to run into some problems with generalization. This is true for novels, it's true for social processes, it's true for historical moments, and so on and so forth. So the challenge for humanist reason is to figure out, since you don't have the ability to control in the way that in certain versions of scientific experiment you can control the situation, you then have to generalize from your evidence without ever being able fully to let go of your evidence, right? And that's a really interesting challenge, and one of the keys to sort of how humanistic work goes well. So it would be a mistake, I think, to say that humanists don't generalize. Humanists generalize all the time. All the time. If you walk into my department and say, what's the difference between the 19th century French novel and the 20th century French novel, or the French novel of the 1840s versus the French novel of the 1850s, I guarantee you'll find somebody who's going to tell you with reasonable confidence what that difference is on the basis of generalization, on the basis of a survey of the evidence that, will be more or less as good as it gets.
Right.
So if you think, again, on the example I use in the book over and over, but it's a perfect example. If you think about the way that we all think about gender today, right? How gender works for all of us. All of that is the result of generalizations made on the basis of humanist research, much of which was done on the basis of a number of very small examples and thought experiments and so on and so forth. So the point is not that humanists don't or can't generalize, but that humanist generalization is always going to be imperfect for the reasons that I've described, which is you cannot control and close off the contextual structures, and because you cannot control and close off the future. Have we really found out what gender is? Do we now know, and for the rest of human history, people can just stop thinking about gender because Judith Butler figured it out 20 years ago, and now we know when we're done? No. I think it would be very foolish to think that. And again, why would it be foolish? Because on the basis of the historical evidence that I have in front of me, that would have been foolish to think in 1975 and in 1955 and in 1935 and in 1835 and so on, despite the fact that, of course, at any one of those instances, I could find you someone who very confidently proclaimed, we've figured out everything we need to know about men and women and how they work. So, the problem of humanist knowledge is, again, this is not a flaw. It is an epistemological necessity of the fact that humanist knowledge is produced about beings who live socially in time and in context. So part of what I would say is someone who says we know everything we need to know about gender is actually not being reasonable from a humanist point of view, because that statement is epistemologically not justified by the evidence we have in front of us. So as we're thinking about what does humanist reason look like, right? And again, you can imagine stepping through these things. How do you generalize from an example? You can easily imagine showing students this. And I think, again, if you think about the thought experiment of that I've just given you, imagine, again, teaching that in a high school and saying, okay, look, we know that, because everyone knows the problem of the specific in general. We all live with it, right? I mean, everyone,
Right.
that's not a scholarly problem. Does the way, if someone who you care about treats you badly once, does that mean that you shouldn't be their friend anymore? It depends on how bad it is, right? We know that, sometimes it's just a little bad. And so they apologize and we get over it, right? There's all sorts of structures that we're evaluating all the time. Is this, I ate asparagus one time, I didn't like it. Should I try it again? Same thing, right? So
Right.
you can begin to show students how these processes that we're describing, which are, of course, also the same processes that science uses, turn out to be really interesting and complicated in the case of human objects or human-oriented objects in ways that are very exciting. And so, again, like imagine an assignment. I once gave my students an assignment to write, this was a long time ago, to write a guide. I said, you have to imagine an alien has come to this planet and they're disguised as a member of your group, whatever your group is, your family, your circle of friends, your fraternity or sorority, the people who are in some club that you're in, some small group of people that you really know a lot about. And they have to pass. And your job is to write them a guide on how to behave at an event that you are at and that you will be at with them in some sort of context. And I had this amazing student write a wonderful guide for this alien visitor on how to behave at an African American funeral in the South.
Wow.
And it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary anthropological document. And of course, it didn't describe every funeral, but it certainly described the funerals she'd been to, and it described them by generalizing. I remember at one point she said, at this point, someone will fall out. And then she defined what falling out, is kind of fake fainting, right? She defined what falling out was. And then she described the kind of person who would fall out. She said it will be, be a woman, it'll be a woman of this age, and so on and so forth. All of these were generalizations based on a limited number of experiences. But she was doing humanistic work. And so, as you, again, imagine what it would look like to teach humanistic method, create an object, locate the object in context, generalize from the object. That sequence, it seems to me, could easily be teachable in schools as a kind of guide or pathway to thinking about what humanist work does. And as with the first two steps where I say create an object, go to the context, there's a looping there. Part of what you're doing is you've got the object, you're looping into context that helps you define the object. Then you're moving forward saying, why do I do this? Now, how can I generalize from this? As you generalize from this, what you do is you compare this to other generalizations and other instances, and you have another looping sort of thing. Is this just funerals in my family? Is this funerals in what are the limits? Is this all African American funerals in the North and South, or is it just in the South? Is it just in Alabama and not Georgia? Right? Those kinds of structures basically are what allow you to then build up a kind of generalization of some kind. And again, some generalizations can be enormous. This is how gender works in general. Some generalizations can be very small. This is how a community of men hanging out in one coffee shop in Chicago organize and live their lives, which is roughly the plot of Talley's Corner, the great work of mid-century sociology. So that would be, and in the book I have a kind of more step-by-step version of this. But that would be a kind of model of what does it look like to think as a humanist? Why is it interesting to think as a humanist? What's compelling about it? And I think it's a model also that I would be very surprised if the scientists listening to your podcast would not see a lot of themselves in. Right? That for me, that I think that the grounds of reason that underlie the division between the science and humanities are much deeper than the sort of surface differences that divide them. And I think often when those divisions divide them, that what they divide is the kinds of relatively easier certainty that are available when you are studying things that don't live in social spaces and don't have minds, from the kinds of difficulties that get created when your main research object is, not only an individual with a complex mind, but an individual there's no such thing as an individual in some sense with a complex mind without a social surrounding that defines and shapes the parameters of that mind, as well as, I should add, a biological and evolutionary context. But I think most immediately, we're dealing in the humanities with objects that have a level of linguistic, social, emotional, structural complexity, historical complexity that simply forces us to make different kinds of claims, and to work very hard to make the kinds of claims that in some cases, in certain situations, are made easy in science. And I think a model of human thought where the goal of the humanities is to one day get to the point where the sciences are, which is to say, easily make generalizable claims with full knowledge and confidence in their ability to work, which is, of course, a very silly model of the sciences, as we know, since the sciences are full of,
right.
Especially the history of medicine, full of mistakes and errors and confidently made claims that turn out to be wrong. But in any case, the demand that the humanities live up to some model of scientific reason is, for me, simply unreasonable. That is to say, it does not correspond to the reality of the evidence, and what the evidence shows us over and over are the epistemological processes that are required to develop strong understandings of it.
Well, Eric, it really is a remarkable book and a remarkable argument. And the one of the best things about it, I think, is the fact that that humanist reason, the principles or articles that you outline and the methods that you describe are really available for everyone. Anyone can use them. Not in the sense that they're sort of easy to do, but in the sense that they aren't owned by only professors of comparative literature, say, right? So they're not
Right.
bound to the disciplines. I think we have time for maybe just one more question before we wrap up. And you do get to a bit of a manifesto in the end where you talk a little bit about how the principles of humanistic reason, humanistic methods, if they were sort of widely adopted or widely, because I think they are widely practiced, but if they were recognized in the way that you describe, it might entail it could inspire sort of structural changes. So how might we restructure the research university in a way that sort of better corresponds to the reasoning that the people working within it are doing?
Well, so I mean, I think that we're in a weird moment, and one of the things I say in the book is that it's very hard to imagine restructuring the humanities, because if for any of your listeners who've been in the humanities for the last 40 or 50 years, anytime anyone in the university says restructuring, what we hear is cuts, collapse.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a group of people who have lots of evidence to suggest when someone comes in suggesting we need a restructuring that it's going to be bad news, and therefore who are incredibly hostile and resistant to the idea of restructuring. And so I want to say that. And that hostility and resistance is not foolish. It's logical and evidence-based. That said, I think that it is one of the things I think that the sciences have actually helped us see in the last 2 decades is how important humanistic thought of the type that I'm describing is already to them. And so I imagine, first of all, I'll just describe some changes that I think should happen in the sciences before describing the much more extensive changes that I think should happen in the humanities. I think that, I have a friend who's an astronomer. I co-teach a class with him, and astronomy, like a lot of departments that do, what you may think of as basic research, struggles occasionally with making things relevant. There's a tendency to basically think that what students need to know is how to calculate, planetary masses and orbits, whereas in fact what students are really interested in is how the universe works. All right, but those classes tend to be the intro classes. They're for dummies. But if you really want to be an astronomer, you end up having to do a lot of stuff that involves calculation. So there's a weird division in astronomy itself and in the sciences between what you do for the gen ed students who aren't going to take another science classes, in which you talk to them about all the interesting ideas and all the cool stuff, and then what you do at the upper level, which is you basically bombard people with a very intense shower of what you might think of as mathematical or pseudo-mathematical work and logic, partly because what you're trying to do is weed out the ones who are going to go to grad school in your field and not. I think this is a really bad way to run a discipline. I think it's weird and sad that if you want to read Galileo or Darwin in the university, you actually have to go to a literature department or a history department to do so. So I would instantly, if I could wave a wand, I would instantly change all the science departments to include history of science and philosophy of science in the departments themselves, not just, and also to include, I think, high end. I mean, that is if you imagine a biology curriculum or a physics curriculum or a chemistry curriculum that is not structured as we do some of this for the kind of plebes, like our big gen ed, the chemistry of life, where we teach some basic principles, and then we have another curriculum which is like organic, and we drive that all the way up hardcore with TAs and so on and so forth, and that's the real curriculum. So imagine erasing that basic model and really imagining a science curriculum that integrates the kinds of things we're talking about, the kinds of interesting questions. So why should imagine again a course on the history of pandemics where should that course be taught, right? Or where do you go to learn not about the actual current functioning of the heart, but histories of the theories of the functioning of the heart? Where do you go to learn about Aristotle's physics? It seems to me those things belong to the sciences and ought to belong to the sciences, um, and ought to be taught. Now, the fact that they're not taught there means they're being taught elsewhere, if they're being taught at all. But that seems to me to be a tragedy, because it reinforces what I'm describing as the difference between the sort of chemistry curriculum for majors and the sort of chemistry of life gen ed type course. So I would like to see a world in which that entire structure was erased, and in which, among other things, writers of what you might think of as popular science, so people like Michio Kaku in physics, or there's a number of people in astronomy whose names are escaping me now, or people who do archaeoastronomy, it's an incredibly interesting field, are not considered to be losers who couldn't do the real research, but actually considered to be, are full professors and are making decisions about admissions in the major and so on and so forth, along with the people who are doing what you might think of as the pure or hard research. Although, again, both the word pure and the word hard are products of such bias and such screwed up, in the case of hard, obviously so gendered a structure, as in my world, you have to it's about getting rid of that basic distinction, which is, of course, the distinction which words are soft and math is hard, and boys are hard and girls are soft, and so on and so forth. You can easily, obviously, map onto the entire university by the gender of their faculty, precisely the distinction I'm describing. And so that's bad, I'll just say. On the humanistic side, I think that the changes required are much more, not required, but the changes I would like to see are much more radical. And I think that one of the things that the humanities have done in order to try to find place in the university, in order to compensate for their inferiority complex, a legitimate inferiority complex, that is, in order to compensate for the fact that they're being treated as inferior, within the framework of modern knowledge and modern judgments about what counts as knowledge, is that they have driven their curriculum largely in a direction that aims to create majors who are experts, quote unquote, in one thing, in the way that someone who majors in chemistry or biology or engineering is an expert in that thing. The reality is that to be a professional humanist scholar today, you can't be an expert in one field. To be a professor of literature, you have to read widely in sociology, philosophy, art history, anthropology, history of science, history of politics, political theory, and so on, right? That is to say that to be a humanist scholar, we have a model of humanist scholarship which is profoundly multidisciplinary and has to be multidisciplinary in order to be viable. And yet our majors basically teach our students that to be a major, whatever that means, then when the students are told they have to have a major, is that you have to do 12 courses in English or 12 courses in history. But that's not so one of the things I would say is that that's just a bad theory of knowing. And so one of the things that I propose in the book is breaking down or breaking apart the structure of humanities majors and humanities programs into what I call in the book modules. So what I imagine is, if you just take all of your humanities faculty, all of your existing humanities faculty, and possibly people, including art history and so on, and you basically get them to create 4-course or 3-course modules on topics, and invite students to take those modules and topics. And I think that one of the things that would do, again, there's a lot more about this in the book, but one of the things that does is it would free students up to commit to specific ideas. And what is an English major? What does it mean? What is a history major? It's like a bunch of stuff. There's like 1,000 ways to be a history major, right? You can do, you can do all European history, you can do Asian history, so on. You can do social history or military history. And the same is true with English. Although, I guess you're going to be reading books in English. But, what if, in fact, you had modules that were centered, instead of being centered around names of disciplines, which are, after all, as far as I'm concerned, not very interesting, they were centered around good ideas, the best ideas that we had, the most exciting topics that we had. So imagine a module called, again, since it's on our mind, imagine a module called viruses and pandemics. And in that module, you'd have an intro course, and then you'd have 6 or 7 courses across the university that would fulfill that requirement. But some of them would be humanistic, and some of them might be, scientific. But a student could do that module. Or imagine a module called "Is Poverty Necessary?" Or maybe if questions don't work, imagine a module called "Wealth and Inequality" that would include courses from history and economics, literature, politics, sociology, anthropology. Imagine a module called, imagine a module called History of China, which would be very conventional, right? So you can imagine some very, modules that we already know in some sense that exist. Imagine a module called, Revolution. Imagine a module called the post-colonial experience, the Black experience, imagine a module called the 1920s, right? So you can have, or imagine a module called migration and immigration. You can imagine each of these modules, and imagine each of these modules was just a collection of courses that would count for the module. So you could have 20 courses that would possibly count for your migration immigration module. But imagine then that what you'd say to students is choose these things that you care about, that you're interested in, and learn something about them. And then imagine students putting together modules to create a curriculum for themselves that would, of course, and you can imagine creating a curriculum that would look very much like a major. So someone does German language, then they do, German history, and then they do German literature. So that's, so they've got 3 modules, looks like a major in German, but that would be their major. You can imagine someone else doing our module on, viruses and pandemic, and a module on wealth and inequality, and then a module on, let's say, the politics of welfare reform, and putting those 3 things together and thinking about, becoming someone who works on some combination of those issues, or someone who knows about some of those issues in ways that are powerful and meaningful. I think that one of the things that humanities have that the sciences often don't, especially feels like engineering, where they're driving students towards a very specific job market. Nursing is another example where you're driving students towards a very specific job market, and you're forced to accredit your students in relation to that job market. On the one hand, that's very nice because you know what you're doing, and you have a big accreditation agency and whatever the official accreditation people, this American Society of Engineers or whatever it is, it tells you what your people have to study. On the other hand, it's a terrible trap. And the humanities have put themselves in that trap without actually having the equivalent job outcomes. So part of what I would suggest is that the humanities actually need to recognize their strengths, and that what I'm describing is not a collapse of the humanities, but a real, an enormous expansion of the humanities that begins by recognizing, as I hope you see in the names of these modules, as opposed to the names of the majors, so many of the things that we're already doing that are already so exciting about the ways that we think. Again, I'm just thinking of colleagues. So imagining a module on addiction. But imagine a module on addiction that includes, people doing work in medicine, but also people doing work in sociology, and also people doing work on, like imagine that you take a course on opium novels, of which there are plenty, as part of that. And imagine that you take a course on sort of Chinese herbal medicine, the history of Chinese herbal medicine.
Well,
And just
Eric,
think about
Eric, I was ready to sign up before you even gave me that module. I was like, what
right.
university is this? Can I teach there?
Yeah,
Anyway.
so I mean, to me, that's so exciting, and I think that I feel. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do with the book is just give people ways to feel really excited and powerful about what it is the humanities do. And so that's I mean, as you can tell, I get so excited about it, I just start naming different things. I've made all of these up as we were talking,
and I was
but
like, yes,
it's just great.
I'll take that one and also that one. So yeah,
Yeah.
I can imagine them all. Anyway.
So if you begin by saying what are the humanities, and then you say, well, we're not failing enrollments, or we're not like particular non-generalizable knowledge. We're these topics that I'm just describing. That's what we are. And then you start talking, then you can start walking and talking a little more proudly. That's part of what I'm trying to do with the book.
Well, Eric, for this reader at least, you succeeded. It's an exciting book, and it's an inspiring book, and it's not a Jeremiad about the death of the humanities or the crisis of the humanities at all. We've taken up a lot of your time. Let me just ask our traditional closing question, which is, what are you working on next? Are you going to teach all these modules?
No, well, I'd love to. I mean, if I realize that given where I am at Penn State, like if I were a dean, I guess I would be trying to do this, but I keep trying to convince deans to do it, and no one's taken me up on it. But I really feel like someone should. So if someone wants to make me a dean, so I can try to put this into practice and work with a group of faculty to do it, that would be really fun and exciting. What I'm working on now is I teach a giant class, like 300 student class on video game culture, and I'm trying to turn that class into a book, which is I think it's called How to Think About the World with Video Games, and it's basically what it really is an introduction for two undergraduates about the complexity and richness and fun of thinking about objects of culture. But the way that the class works at Penn State is that, of course, the vast majority of the students who take it are into video games and don't know anything about the humanities. In fact, I think the last time I taught it with 300 kids, I had 4 humanities majors, and then a ton of engineering students and computer science students. Basically, a bunch of students who were afraid of a traditional humanities class who are trying to fulfill their humanities requirement by taking a class on video games, which they think will be fun. And they're not wrong. But, that's just the trick to get them in the door. And what the class is really about is about how culture works and how to think about it, and how technology interacts with the ways that they live, how gender operates in relation to culture, how language and history shape who we are today, about how ideology and so on and so forth. So that's why the book is called How to Think About the World with Video Games. The video games is the trick to get people in the door, but it's really a book about that and about what it means to do that well.
Well, Eric, that sounds like a lot of fun, and I hope you'll come back to the New Books Network and talk to us about that one when it's out.
Fingers crossed.
Okay. Thanks for coming to the show today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. This was really fun. Thank you so much.